Good morning or afternoon, whenever you're watching this video. This is the video devotional for June 28th, the last Sunday of June. And I'm focusing this devotional on Psalm 120, which is the first psalm in a section called the Songs of Ascent. This psalm is a song that was sung by Jewish pilgrims who were preparing to journey to the house of the Lord, that is the temple in Jerusalem. It's the first of 15 psalms, ranging from Psalm 120 to Psalm 134, in the Songs of Ascent, psalms sung on the way to the temple. These are psalms for the pilgrim, people who are going someplace, but really not just to a place, to a person, to God. This psalm reflects pilgrims on their way to the temple to worship God in his house. This psalm for us today is, of course, not for us to travel on a map or make a physical journey and going to Jerusalem and then to the Temple Mount. We're pilgrims not going to a place on a map. Rather, we're journeying to God through Jesus Christ and the power of the Holy Spirit. Soon we will travel once again across roads in our cars to Crestline Church of the Nazarene. Yay, I can't wait. We know that the building is not God's house in the way the temple was God's house in the Old Testament, but it is a place we gather to worship. It's the place where God has met us in wonderful times, and it's even home base for ministry to our communities. But most of all, it's where we meet God and one another on the Lord's Day. So I think it's okay to think of our church facility, and specifically the sanctuary, as God's house in many ways, as long as we don't lose the sight of the biblical teaching that we, you and I, are temples of the Holy Spirit. The Apostle Paul writes about that in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Coming to church, or more accurately, the building at 500 East Main Street, Crestline, Ohio, is important, and God meets us there. But that's not the whole picture. Having said all of that, I'm excited for the time in our near future when we will once again gather together. I feel like the Jewish pilgrims of old who would begin their long journeys to the temple by singing this psalm. Now I'll read for you Psalm 120. In my trouble I cried to the Lord, and he answered me. Deliver my soul, O Lord, from lying lips, from a deceitful tongue. What shall be given to you, and what more shall be done to you, you deceitful tongue? Sharp arrows of the warrior, with the burning coals of the broom tree. Woe is me, for I sojourn in Meshech, for I dwell among the tents of Kedar. Too long has my soul had its dwelling with those who hate peace. I am for peace, but when I speak, they are for war. The Jewish pilgrim's journey to Jerusalem and ours begin with what is called a lament. That's what this psalm is. It's a lament. Lament means to express or feel sorrow for something and to mourn over it. If you missed last Wednesday's devotional on the Beatitude called Blessed Are Those Who Mourn, for they shall be comforted, why don't you go back and listen to that for a fuller description and experience of mourning and the comfort we can receive through Jesus. I find it interesting that God inspired the Jewish people to begin their journey to the temple, to return to worship and into his presence by mourning and lamenting. For some of us, that may feel right. In all the excitement of the soon end of our absence from gathered worship, we feel a weight, a sadness that we need to express to the Lord. And that's okay. Don't feel ashamed or odd, because even in the coming joy of returning to church, your heart is heavy. Each of us has our reasons and our own laments. If this is where or how you begin your journey, I want you to know that that is fine, and it's even biblical. The journey back to worship in this psalm begins in a hard place, partly because the psalmist is so far from God's house, the temple in Jerusalem. Many believe, as I said earlier, that these psalms of ascents were used by Jewish pilgrims to gather at the temple, specifically 3 different times of the year around the great religious festivals: the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or we often call it Passover, the Feast of Weeks, or First Fruits, which the New Testament refers to as Pentecost, and then the Feast of Booths, or Tabernacles. And we read about this in Deuteronomy 16. And since these pilgrims are far from God's house and presence, we also see in verse 5 that they're far from God's people as well. And the journey back to worship in this psalm begins in being cut off from God and his people. Verse 5 in Psalm 120, the psalmist says he lives in Meshech, which is a place on the map in northeastern Turkey, very far from Jerusalem. And then Kedar is in the Arabian desert and was inhabited by a very violent tribe among the Arabians who were descendants of Ishmael. In other words, the psalmist is saying not only is he physically far away from God's house, he's cut off from God's people, he's living among Gentiles. This is what I hear. I find myself in a very worldly place. We'd say something today like, I'm not in Kansas anymore. When did the atmosphere of this world become so anti-God? Or more specifically for us today, so anti-Christ? The psalmist, thousands of years ago, is not alone in these sentiments. The journey begins in a hard place because this world is a hard place. But also, he talks about two specific issues in this psalm. In verses 2 and 4, he talks about harsh and hurtful language. He says that people are either lying to or about himself, and that they're speaking harshly to him, that the words are like the arrows of a warrior. And then also, in verses 6 and 7, the psalmist talks about the people around him are against peace. We would say today are anti-shalom. They're for war. And remember, shalom is more than just the peace as in the absence of violent conflict. It's the peace that represents God's vision, God's purpose for his creation. It's the fullness of what he wills for us. The psalmist, and we, live in the daily reality that this world does not reflect God's vision and purposes of shalom, or the deep abiding peace. The psalmist is saying, and we can agree, I struggle to be godly in a place like this. I need to be closer to God and his people. I need to be in his house. This lament reminds us just how much we need God, how much we need to worship him, and how much we need to gather with his people. The journey to the temple and our journey back to gathered worship begins not with a date on the calendar telling us it is time. It begins in our hearts, crying out for God. It begins with the sense of this I must do. I have to get back to God. I have to get into his house. I have to be with his people. Our world, like the psalmist, is immersed in lies, hurtful words, anger, and resisting God's plan and vision. We long for a better time and place. One of my favorite songs from my childhood is Home, Home on the Range. As we sing, it is a place where never is heard a discouraging word, not even from my own lips. What do we usually do about all of this? How do we respond to all this that creates a lament deep within us? Well, too often we hide or distract ourselves. We have hobbies, we travel, we read novels, watch TV, we drink, we do drugs, we hide in our own little and safe world. We focus on other people's problems and criticize them, ignoring our own hurts. Have you ever thought why these things are so sinful? Because they keep us from running to God. They distract us from seeking him and seeking first his kingdom. We do anything but journey to God. We sense this so deeply because as God's children, we long for truth and peace instead of lies and war. This song calls us to make a choice. Will I stay in the land of lies and anger or journey to God, experience his peace? I hope you join me in continuing and continually journeying to God. There's no resolution to this psalm. By that I mean there's no happy ending. We're just kind of left hanging in a hard place. Well, this psalm begins the journey. Just like traveling by foot across a continent takes a long time, sometimes our journey to God from our place of lament into his presence, it takes some time. We keep going forward with God, but without certainty as to what will happen next. We're not there yet. We are still journeying. This is the very definition of faith. The Apostle Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians that we walk by faith, not by sight. That's in chapter 5, verse 7. In Hebrews, we read these wonderful verses that describe this journey of faith. It was by faith that Abraham obeyed when God called him to leave home and go to another land that God would give him as his inheritance. He went without knowing where he was going, and even when he reached the land God promised him, he lived there by faith. For he was like a foreigner, living in tents, and so did Isaac and Jacob, who inherited the same promise. Abraham was confidently looking forward to a city with eternal foundations, a city designed and built by God. We will soon be together in God's house. Let us journey together with purpose and faith. God bless you.